Hey, my name is Cavalier Samurai. I know that's maybe a bit of a goofy name. Sorry, I just thought of it in like the last 5 minutes after making a YouTube channel. This video will probably go up a few days from now. The name comes in two parts. The samurai part comes from the fact that I am an insufferable weeaboo with great admiration and interest in the Japanese imperial system and spirituality. And the first part, the cavalier part, comes from my deep interest and admiration for the state of Virginia, especially its colonial past and the cultural mores and ideas brought over by the distressed Cavaliers in the mid-1600s after the parliamentarian victory in the English Civil War. This channel is really mostly for, I guess, shitposting, just rambling shitposts. I have a Facebook page where I post a lot of just random historical and cultural spiels. And I thought it might be nice to instead make a YouTube channel. And it might be more fun to make videos instead of just typing out long, rambly things, screeds. So today what I'd like to talk about is something that's been tickling my interest for a couple of days now. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 in Britain being a Germanic conquest, again, of Britain against a Celtic elite, or a Celtic, at least a Celtic monarchy, although there was no single Celtic monarchy during the first Germanic conquest with the Anglo-Saxons, Angles and Saxons coming over. But I definitely believe that the House of Hanover, much more, and before them, of course, William of Orange, really represented Germanic kingship, traditional Germanic kingship, more strongly than anyone else who had ruled England since Harold Godwinson. And this stood in stark contrast to the Catholic-style absolutism of the Stuarts. Now, what I mean by Catholic absolutism, and I'm sorry for walking around so much here, it's just a little bit easier when I talk, I get excited. The Catholic style of monarchy officially, sort of theoretically, recognizes the Pope as the overlord of the king. The Pope, of course, is spiritually speaking a descendant of the position of Roman emperor, sort of a cosmopolitan ruler over many disparate peoples. And the kings, the Catholic monarchs, all sort of rule in his stead as vassals to the Pope, the Roman emperor. They're sort of client kings. And you see this, for example, in the signing of the Magna Carta. When the Magna Carta was signed, Pope, I believe it was Innocent the Third. He was very strongly against the signing of the Magna Carta, in part because it initially declared that England should have a free and independent church again. This was later taken out, and in part because he was against the weakening of the powers of the king, because the king was his sort of vassal. He saw himself as the overlord in the feudal system. And the King John Lackland, bad King John, as he's called, I don't know exactly how bad he was. I haven't researched him enough to give an opinion on that. But a weakening of his power was a weakening of the Pope's power. When you look at the conquest of England by the Normans, that was heavily encouraged by Pope Alexander II, I believe, and partly due to the fact that England was not so strongly under the sway of Rome at the time of 1066, whereas the Normans were. Of course, they were heavily influenced by the French. I mean, they kind of were French, kind of not. I mean, there's some... ethnic identities are hard, right? Cultural identities are hard to define sometimes. But, France, of course, has been called before the first daughter of the Church, the Catholic Church. And the Normans spoke French. They mostly had French mothers. Their maternal lines were mostly French because when the Norsemen settled there, they didn't have women with them, so they intermarried with French women. So just for the sake of convenience, we'll say that the Normans were French. So a more heavily Catholic French faction, of course, was going to be favored, even though the Anglo-Saxons were still kind of Catholic and under the still kind of within the realm of Western Christianity, which would be Catholicism at that time, the Roman Church. At that time, they weren't quite as gung-ho about it as further south in Europe. There's a good book. I read this a long time ago, so I don't remember the exact details, but it was the Germanization of Early Medieval Christianity by James Russell. I believe that's what I'm thinking of, where they talk a little bit about how when Christianity was brought to the Germanic peoples, the Semitic elements were kind of steadily filtered out and replaced with more Germanic imagery. I mean, you see that in Beowulf as well, that really heavily kind of pagan Germanic story, but with lots of Christian references peppered in, and you see that sort of warriorization, if I can say that, of Christianity. And the Anglo-Saxons at the time, they practiced a form of Christianity probably, maybe a bit more akin to Orthodoxy in Eastern Europe, or Anglicanism, maybe not modern Anglicanism, which is very, of course, progressive and left-wing, but the concept of Anglicanism, an independent English Germanic church, the same way the Russians have a church for Russians and the Greeks have a church for Greeks, etc. Like I said, the Normans were more heavily Catholicized, Romanized, and when the time came that the war was a-brewing, the succession dispute after Edward the Confessor's death, the Pope, being the overlord of all Christendom, threw in his hat with the Normans, supported the Norman conquest, and the Norman conquest really. It brought feudalism for one thing. The Anglo-Saxon society was a little bit more of a Volksgemeinschaft. There was a little bit more kinship. Of course, there was a class system. Of course, there was hereditary. Heredity was part of your position in that society. But I mean, it was more open. It was a bit more communal. For one thing, there was the communal forests, the hunting grounds, much of it which was confiscated by the Normans to become private hunting grounds for the new elite. But the Norman conquest really sort of, for one thing, it brought in much more heavy Catholic Roman influence. It brought in foreign usurers to fund the projects of the new kings. It was a much more authoritative, much less free Germanic society than had existed in independent Anglo-Saxon times. Now, over time, eventually, there was mixing between the Normans and the Saxons. I know that there's like some society called the Anglo-Saxon Foundation that's all about like, ooh, Normans out. It's like an obscure internet group, which I found interesting, though it's not something that I'm really on board with. There was heavy intermarriage between the Normans and Saxons over time. I believe at this point, well, there was the War of the Roses a bit later in the 1400s, and that killed so many scions of noble Norman houses that a lot of merchants and lesser gentry and such were able to intermarry with the peerage, which is very different from, say, France or Germany. Germany was so obsessed with, preserving noble lineage that I believe it was in the 1300s there were laws against being allowed to joust, even if you were legitimate. This wasn't talking about bastard sons of nobles. Even if you were legitimate, but one of your parents was not part of the nobility, you weren't allowed to partake in tournaments. This was in, I can't remember which medieval German state this was, but I'll link the article. There was an article about bastards in medieval Germany that you might find interesting that I'll link. But when you contrast medieval Germany, medieval to early modern France, Poland, don't get me started on the history of Poland and the almost racial exclusivity of the Szlachta. England did have a much more open social system compared to much of Europe. So I'm not going to imply that there was this, cruel, heavy-handed Norman ethnic despotism throughout their history. But I mean, early on it was. I mean, look at the harrying of the North, and some people would refer to that as a genocide. So anyway, you had a conquest of the Germanic people by a Latin Catholic ethnos, I guess. And they brought in foreign usurers, they brought in foreign priests, etc., and brought in a much more hard sort of monarchy that didn't rule with the consent of the people. Over time, this was softened, especially with the Magna Carta, and many of those nobles who were part of the Barons' War. I haven't researched their genealogy quite as much as I'd like to, but I imagine this might have been sometime after the intermixing between the Saxon upper class and the Norman conquerors. But you had the signing of the Magna Carta, the softening of the Norman monarchy, and actually, it's interesting, if you look at the English peerage today, I believe there are only two still existing titles that can trace their lineage back paternally. Of course, you've got mother's branches and things, but in the direct paternal line that can trace their ancestry back to either Norman origin or at least a Norman who came over with William. One of them is the Earl of Shrewsbury. That title is within the Talbot, is held by the Talbot family, and they can trace their line paternally back to a Norman ancestor. And there's one other that I can't think of at the moment. But so there's actually only two families now in Britain that hold a peerage. Not, of course, there are other, Fitzhughs and Fitzalans and such. But in terms of holding a hereditary peerage, there's only two that are of direct Norman ancestry. So I would not go so far as to say there's still a Norman despotism in England or anything like some more eccentric people believe. But if we want to talk about the features of Germanic kingship, They are, I'm going to quote the Wikipedia article on Germanic kingship. The Germanic kings originally had three main functions: to serve as a judge during the popular assemblies, to serve as a priest during the sacrifices, and to serve as military leaders during wars. The office was received hereditarily, but a new king required the consent of the people before assuming the throne. All sons of the king had the right to claim the throne, which often led to co-rulership, diarchy, where two brothers were elected kings at the same time. This evolved into the territories being considered the hereditary property of kings, patrimonies, a system which fueled feudal wars because kings could claim ownership to lands beyond their de facto rule. So, I actually see a lot of similarities here in Germanic kingship with the Japanese monarchy. Now, the Japanese monarchy, of course, has a lot of differences. One thing, the Japanese royal family has never been replaced, unlike most monarchies wherein there's always been, different houses. I mean, you look at England, we've got the House of Windsor, Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, Hanover, Stuart, Tudor, Plantagenet, in the House of Normandy, all sort of ruling. You look at the different ruling houses of France, Bourbon, Valois, and Capetian, and then further back into Carolingian, Merovingian. Russia has had two, the Romanovs and the Rurikids. Don't even get me started on the Byzantines. China has had, I can't name how many dynasties. I'm not really well versed in Chinese history. But Japan has only ever had one. And part of that is due to, one, the royal lineage claimed by the Japanese royal family, descendants of Amaterasu, the sun goddess. And because of their royal lineage, they acted more as priests than secular rulers. They were sort of the high priest of the nation. In fact, some Portuguese travelers early on in the 1500s, when they were visiting Japan, referred to the shogun as the emperor and the emperor as sort of the pope of Japan. Of course, they knew they weren't Catholic, but when they were coming up with an analogy to compare it to systems in Europe. So in the early Germanic kings served as priests. They oversaw the ceremonies, the religious ceremonies, and they were elected. They ruled by the consent of the people. Now, this was not some populist, quote, meritocracy in the sense that we have today in America, or really any Western country where someone who's well liked enough can become the head man in charge. I mean, it was received hereditarily. But he required the consent of the people before assuming the throne. So, and all sons of the king had the right to claim the throne. In fact, if I remember right, I'll have to look for the article, but I believe it was past the sons of the king. I think it was up to like the great-grandsons or great-great-grandsons of any previous king. Could claim, if you were within, I believe, 3 generations in Anglo-Saxon England, you were they had a special name for it, but if you were within 3 generations of a past deceased king, you could present yourself to the council of nobles, thanes, I believe, and be eligible for appointment as the king. So you had to come from, you had to come from a clan that people knew were capable of producing good leaders. It wasn't just, Mr. Nobody from nowhere sort of shows up and talks a big game and everyone gets behind him and then he becomes the king. And I mean, we've seen how that's gone in the past. I mean, there was a sense of hereditary importance, and this is because in pre-Christian times they traced their lineage back to Woden or Wotan or Odin or whatever you want to call him. in a similar manner to, again, the way the Japanese emperors traced their lineage to Amaterasu, the sun goddess. So just like Japan, Germanic kingship depended on divine lineage through which the kings claimed their right to rule. Now, like I said, the Saxon kings claimed their descent from Woden, while the Scandinavian kings, I remember this from one of Survive the Jives videos, I believe he said that the Scandinavian monarchs claimed descent from Frigg. Now, what he said was that Frigg represented, if I remember right, kind of the priestly ideal. And so did Wotan in Germanic, Germanic, it's all Germanic, but I mean sort of Scandinavian Norse culture versus more continental Germanic culture, represented sort of the idea of the priest and the will of the gods, and that's more what was meant by their claiming descent from these gods. I think that really could be part of it. I have maybe a little bit more of a materialistic view. I think that it's likely that it's some mix of a divine mystical concept and probably descent from some sort of very great chief, that had done so well and was so powerful that he was later deified by his people. Because just the question I have is that at what point did people start believing that it was a real guy and not just some mystical concept? At what point did they forget that this god is just a representation of spiritual concept rather than he literally is a descendant of the gods. Now, there probably is an overlap with the spiritual concept, but I really think that there had to be something literal in there for them to have taken it so seriously. But I'm not a super spiritual person myself, but still. I read an article a while ago, I'll try to find a link to put in the description, where it mentions something like half of Western European men descending from some certain war chief in Neolithic times. So, I mean, there were big, powerful guys out there who clearly controlled a lot of territory in prehistoric times, Neolithic times, who probably bred a lot, and through that became progenitor of a lot of powerful families. Their sons became chiefs and so on. So I believe it was something more akin to that, and maybe the spiritual aspect of, Frigg or Odin are spiritual concepts rather than literal men, kind of grafted onto that, or the lineage of these great men was grafted onto the spiritual concept. Who knows? But that's just my opinion on that matter. But yeah, so but to go back, to rewind, the Germanic kings ruled by the consent of the people, and they it was a limited monarchy. It was not an absolute monarchy, even with their descent from the gods or great men or whoever you believe Odin and Frigg were, as opposed to the Catholic monarchies that ruled by virtue of being vassals to the emperor in Rome or the Pope. Now, when you look at the lineage of these two feuding royal houses, the Stuarts, and I know it was initially William of Orange, the House of Orange, who came over to England with his wife, but then he died childless, and it went to his sister-in-law, and then she died childless, and it went to George I, and then there were two Jacobite Stuart risings that were put down by the House of Hanover. So, these two feuding houses, if you look into their genealogies, and this is something that I find very fascinating, I'm a bit of an amateur genealogist myself. So I have it down here. So the Stuarts, of course, were Scots. Now it's a little bit hard to assign an exact cultural heritage to royal houses because they intermarried with other royal houses. So it's hard to say, well, this person's a Scot, or the King of England, of course, coming from a German background, or the Russians coming from a German background, or French. Well, I believe the House of Bourbon came from what's now Spain. So are they a Spanish house, a French house? It's hard to define the cultural origins of a royal family, but they lived in Scotland for centuries. So you could say they were a Scottish royal house. James the First was the King of Scotland before he was the King of England, but the House of Stuart, they are lineally, paternally descended from a Breton knight. Of course, Brittany in the northwest of France that looks like a little hand or finger sticking out into the sea. There was a Breton knight who came over with William the Conqueror named Alan Fitzflad, or Flad, who I believe is also an ancestor of Edward the First, or no, maybe his wife. Anyway, a lot of later monarchs share descent from Alan Fitzflad, but the Alan's descendants were eventually made hereditary high stewards of Scotland. There was a lot of overlap between Scotland and England. There were Norman elites in both. A few Scottish clans, especially in the Lowlands, claimed their descent from Norman lords or barons or whatever. So there was a lot of overlap between the kingdoms. In fact, southern England, I'm going to do a video later on that, on the so-called Ulster Scots or Scot-Irish. But the area that they mostly descend from, northern England, southern Scotland, has a very blurred history. So Alan Fitzflad comes from Brittany. Now, Brittany is very interesting because where does the name Brittany come from? It comes from Britain itself. When many of the Romano-British were fleeing from what became England, fleeing the Saxon incursions, a lot of them ended up in northwestern France, which at the time was still under Roman control, if I'm not mistaken, and a significant enough number of them came over that the area was renamed Brittany after Britain itself, and the people there were called Bretons or Britons, and so you have a Romano-British house, essentially. The House of Stuart eventually, the name Stuart comes from the fact that they were high stewards of Scotland, Steward, though I believe they spelt it Stuart as the surname. They have their origins in Brittany. They're descendants of the original, Romano-British, Celtic Britons, etc. They eventually, of course, on the death of Elizabeth I, they become the new royal house of Britain. James I was a cousin of Elizabeth I. Somewhere back there, he was also a descendant of Henry VII, her grandfather, and he was the closest male relative, so he was made the king. So you had a Celtic Breton ruling family in charge of England, who were eventually Catholic, in the sense of, James I, good guy. He published the Bible in English. He started the first colony. I believe he started the first colony in Virginia. Well, of course, Jamestown. I think Sir Francis Drake discovered Virginia, if I remember right, and named it after Queen Elizabeth, but it wasn't settled until with Englishmen until the reign of James. So he sort of started my favorite state of Virginia. I know you can kind of say, like, why do you call yourself a Cavalier if you've got sort of a little bit of a beef with the House of Stuart? Well, I don't really have a beef with the House of Stuart per se. I think James I was great. I think that Charles I was all right. Certainly shouldn't have had his head chopped off. I think I have some sympathy with the problems Parliament had, and I'll go into further detail with those in a later video probably. But I do admire I feel at least much more affiliation with the Royalists during that period than the dour, Semitizing Puritans. I have a couple of ancestors who are part of that cultural milieu, or whatever you want to call it, on the Royalist side during the 17th century. William Berkeley, who founded the colony of Virginia, was one of the first governors who sort of established the Germanic, sort of established the Southern Cavalier ideal, who brought over the distressed Cavalier Royalist refugees from England after the Civil War. The House of Berkeley, he's actually a distant relative of my own. I share descent from the House of Berkeley. The Berkeleys, I talked earlier about Norman-descended families in the peerage. Well, there are 3 families that can claim descent in the paternal line from Anglo-Saxon times. Those are the Berkeleys, the Swintons, and the Aardens, and William Shakespeare's mother actually was an Arden. So there are 2 families in the peerage that can still trace their descent from Normans, and there are 3 families not in the peerage except for Baron Berkeley, but the other 2, the Ardens and Swintons, aren't members of the British nobility. But those are 3 families, the only 3 families, period, who are verified to trace their paternal descent back from Anglo-Saxon times. But yeah, so I have this admiration for the Anglo-Saxons, much more strong than my admiration for the Normans. But like I said, the founder of sort of Virginia Cavalier culture was himself of very strong Saxon roots, Anglo-Saxon roots, William Berkeley. Later, I'm going to make some videos about Southern race mythology and the idea of the Norman Cavalier versus the Yankee Saxon Puritan. That'll be fun, George Fitzhugh and all that. But back on point, talking about this Breton Celtic royal house that was ruling Britain and Saxon England, they were displaced by a royal family from northern Germany, Hanover, the House of Hanover. I know Hanover isn't Saxony, but Hanover is in the region that was defined as Old Saxony in the Middle Ages, the northern chunk of Germany, northern corner of Germany, where the Saxons, and I believe it overlaps a bit with where the Angles came from too. So both the Angles and Saxons, and then you had the other people, Frisians and such, and Utes who came over, but that northern chunk of Germany, Saxons and Angles and Saxons came from. Hanover is part of that. So the House of Hanover comes from a region historically where the Old Saxons came from. A further point of interest is the symbol of the House of Hanover is the white horse. Now, the white horse is very heavily associated with Hengist and Horsa, the 2 Saxon brothers who originally came over and conquered the Romano-British. If you believe the mythology about it, Vortigern invited them over, and then they decided we wanted land, and so on and so on. But anyway, the leaders of the Germanic migration into England were Hengist and Horsa, the 2 twins. Whether they were real or not, who knows? but their banner was a white horse. This is according to John Aubrey, a 17th century historian, in his Monumenta Britannica. Now, granted, you go back into the 1600s and 1700s, mythology and history still kind of overlap, but still, this is in the English sort of zeitgeist anyway, is that the white horse was their standard at the conquest of Britain. Some people go as far as to say that the, I can't think of what it's called, the Uffington horse, the white Uffington horse, it probably, nobody really knows exactly how old it is. Generally, it's dated back to pre-Saxon times, but some people ascribe it to the time of the Saxon conquest because the horse was so important to the Anglo-Saxon imagery. To quote the Wikipedia article on Hengist and Horsa, it says, "Some would maintain that the premier animal of the Indo-European sacrifice and ritual was probably the horse. We have already seen how its embedment in Proto-Indo-European society lies not just in its lexical reconstruction, but also in the proliferation of personal names which contain horse as an element among the various Indo-European peoples. Furthermore, we witness the importance of the horse in Indo-European rituals and mythology. One of the most obvious examples is the recurrent depiction of twins, such as the Indic Asvins, or horsemen, the Greek horsemen Castor and Pollux, the legendary Anglo-Saxon settlers Horsa and Hengist, or the Irish twins Masha, born after their mother had completed a horse race. All of these attest to the existence of Indo-European divine twins associated with or represented by horses." So you have, to reiterate, you have a Romano-British, a Breton royal house directly descended in the paternal line from a Briton knight, then ruling over England and vassals to the Roman Emperor, the Pope, suddenly being displaced by a Germanic royal family who fight under the banner of the White Horse of Hanover, who institute more constitutional Germanic kingship, sort of put the nail in the coffin of papist rule. And really, you had the start of the British Empire, of course, beginning in the 1600s, but sort of the height of British power was after the, Germanic conquest. Now, granted, you could say that it also had the seeds of its own destruction in the more liberal Germanic monarchy. I disagree with that. I think there were other factors at play, mostly just modernism in general. We see how absolutism really destroys societies. When Louis XIV's absolutism destroyed France because he took the teeth out of the nobility and gentry and imprisoned them in a gilded cage at Versailles and replaced them with a bunch of bourgeois clerks who, a couple of generations later, began to resent their subordinate position to the aristocracy, people like Robespierre and such, and engineered the revolution. Russian autocracy, autocracy, orthodoxy, and nationality were their very call words, and we saw what happened there. China, if you compare China with Japan, China had very centralized rule under the emperor. He completely emasculated the nobility, surrounded himself with eunuchs and mandarins, the scribe class, whose membership was only sort of dependent on how well you could memorize Confucian texts. And China stagnated until the beginning of the 1900s, really past the 1900s, really stagnated until Mao's time, when he dragged them kicking and screaming into modernity, like Stalin did with Russia. As opposed to Japan, which was ruled by a feudal warrior elite whose membership was dependent on martial service. You had peasants who worked their way up through brave martial service. Toyotomi Hideyoshi, for example, who were granted, membership in the samurai class or noble class because of their heroism. And if something happened to the shogun, if a shogun's dynasty was gone, well, the royal family would still be around because the emperor really wasn't super politically powerful. Rome, of course, was at its peak as a patrician republic before it became consolidated as an empire. Then it culturally declined and fell apart. And the reason that this happens is because an autocrat does not trust the other intelligent, good people. Like I said, that's not necessarily dependent on birth, but I mean, people were able to work their way into that class. The head man in charge, as an autocrat, doesn't trust anyone else. And he weakens the best and brightest for fear that they might displace him, and then he empowers mediocre bourgeois types who then undermine and destroy the society. So who knows, if things had kept going as they were, if there had been a Stuart ruling family in Britain throughout the 1700s, who's to say it wouldn't have ended up like France, a French Revolution. And even worse off than modern Britain is today, if you want to look at its political situation. So furthermore, when you look at the Jacobite uprisings, people want to complain about the brutality of the House of Hanover and what they did to Scotland. Well, if you look at the history of Scotland, the Lowland Scots were primarily on the side of the British. On the side of the House of Hanover. They were culturally much more similar to the British. Like I said, there was a lot of overlap between the Scots and the Lowland Scots and the Northern English. It was hard to tell where one began and the other ended. And then you look at the Bonnie Prince Charlie's army, and they're romanticized very heavily by Sir Walter Scott and other sort of Victorian writers, and now today by Americans who think that they're of Highland descent, even though nearly every American of Scottish background is in fact Scot-Irish or Ulster Scot, and even then that's even more of a misnomer, but we'll get into that at a later date. But I mean, they were mostly conscripted tenants forced by the Scottish clan leaders to fight, against the House of Hanover. And most of the atrocities, many of the atrocities were done by the Lowland Scots in revenge on the Highland Scots for, years of cattle raids and things like that. And then a few generations later, you had the Highland clearances, where it was their own elites, not the English. It was the Highland chiefs who were evicting the Highlanders off their lands. So their grandfathers conscripted their grandfathers to go fight for a Catholic king that they had nothing to really do with, and then a few generations later evicted them. That wasn't the House of Hanover's doing, So. It's my belief that the Germanic conquest by the House of Hanover was a positive thing that later just fell apart. The English society was more worse off for the Industrial Revolution rather than the conquest of the House of Hanover. I really hope to. And another note about the Germanic high priest ideal. Sort of going back into that is how I need to look up the title Defender of the Faith. I'm not sure if other European monarchies use the title Defender of the Faith, but of course the monarch of England is the head of the Church of England and is the defender of the faith. So they're the high priest of their people, the same way that the ancient Germanic kings were. Or priestess, I guess, in the case of Queen Elizabeth II. And Victoria, we've had queens. Let me see if there's anything else I want to cover here. Nothing right now comes to mind. I hope to make more videos in the future. But, a good thing I watched that gave some more insight into the Norman conquest was a video by Carolyn Emmerich about elite-driven social engineering in the Norman conquest. I'm not on board 100% with all of it. I don't, but I mean it gives more context into the conquest by the Catholic Church and the radical changes, negative changes done to Germanic Anglo-Saxon society by the conquest. So thanks for sticking around. I appreciate it. I know that was a long ramble. I hope you found it interesting. If you did, please like and subscribe. It sounds weird saying that. I've heard other YouTubers say it for the longest time. And this is my first one. But yeah, if you wouldn't mind, please like and subscribe. And I hope to make more videos soon in the future. All right, thank you very much. God save the Queen.